Let's talk about configuration validation, and more specifically, like a bit of history of how we got here and what's the current state of the system. This will not be a live demo. I'm not as confident as Wim in my live demo skills, so we'll do it like this, and hopefully you'll all learn something. So my name is Joris. I work for Calibrate, which is a company in Belgium. We exist for 20 years this year, so it's our anniversary around this time. So that's really nice. So configuration. What is configuration really? In Drupal, configuration is the collection of settings that allow you to configure a site. Some examples of these are content types, taxonomy vocabularies, views, search API configuration, facets configuration, paragraph types, those kind of things, all configuration-like things. At least this is how Drupal itself defines this. What is validation? So we're all on the same page. Validation is a check to ensure that the values that are attached to a thing are sensible and feasible, that they actually mean something. Now, why would we want configuration to be validated? Well, Wim, as pictured here, told me before that basically when it's all validated in detail and with great strictness, new possibilities emerge. So the system that we have today can be enhanced, can be improved with new things. What are those? Well, actually a lot of things. The most important one being regression or fault detection in configuration. This could mean automatic updates, being able to check if the config that exists in your site will actually still be valid or still be good with the new config schema that's being pulled in. Automatic deployments will be more stable because you can make sure that your configuration is okay. Your config import itself can also be more stable. Configuration splits can be more reliable because you can split part of a config depending on which environment you're on or which time of day or whatever kind of split you're making. This split should still result into a valid and feasible piece of configuration, and we can validate with config schema validation. Recipes are also a thing that can be enabled with config validation, specifically a recipe that can update a part of a configuration. If that new recipe that adds that config action update would do something that's not valid for the system, then we can check it and we can roll back the recipe. This goes into recipe checkpoints and config checkpoints. We're not gonna go into that in this session, but it's the underlying part of this is a good and a nicely configured piece of configuration. JSON API, REST, and GraphQL are things that we all probably know. They work today on content. If we want to have them to work on configuration, then we should make sure that the patch coming in or the update coming in is actually something that makes sense for this site. If Experience Builder version 2 or phase 2 or whatever they want to call it, if that wants us to update views through the new Experience Builder stuff, it's probably going to go over JSON API or over REST. This validation that we're adding now will enable that to work without breaking sites. This will lead to a true decoupled admin. If that's something that we actually want, I'm not sure, but it's enabling this. And as a stretch goal, this is something that Alex has told me a couple of times that this might actually be a feasible thing, is we could validate Drupal configuration in a strict manner from a tool that's not Drupal. So imagine something really light, a really light PHP script or a Rust script or whatever that can validate your configuration in like 2 or 3 seconds before you're actually even going to run all your tests or run your config import or whatever. This will allow feedback to be much faster on our customer sites in checking if the thing is sensible. So let's go into some history, like how did we get to configuration in the first place and validated configuration in the second place. This is the first commit message that I could find on Drupal.org for something that has to do with variable get or variable set. This is 23 years ago when I took the screenshots. This is the first time that we see some mention about variable get. Let's skip ahead a bit to Drupal 8. In the right corner of the slides, the right bottom corner, you will always see the version number of which version of Drupal this was being introduced in. So file-based configuration is the thing that replaced variable get and variable set, as well as many one-off storage systems that were there, such as for image styles and other things, and allows configuration to be exported and imported to the file system, as well as having staged different instances of the same site. Later in that cycle, we added the schema format for configuration, so that there is actually a format that belongs to those YAML files that we all know. And this is actually one that I find really funny. All of these will be titles of release notes on Drupal.org, so you can just Google for this and you will end up on Drupal.org. Before this commit, there was only one type of data in your config, and it's a string. True is a string. A number is a string. Everything was a string all the time, and we used to convert back and forth to those data types all the time on config import and export and everywhere. So this actually supports primitive data types, removes forced typecasting so that config values can be stored and retrieved in the same format that they actually are supposed to be used in. So it's a way for Drupal to actually use the correct data types. This was before Drupal 8 was even released, but it's still like the first step towards something stricter or more correct towards the actual intention of the data. So the first actual config validation that was added was for UUIDs. This was in Drupal 8.4. So 2 years after the release of Drupal 8, that's when the first piece of validation was added. And the actual change in Git is this. So we're changing from a type string to a type UUID. This means that now this is not just a string, but it's a string with a special type, a special shape. This type is defined as a type string, so config types can extend each other, or config schema types can extend each other. This UUID extends string, and it has one special constraint, and this constraint is that it has to be a UUID. This is defined by a UUID constraint, where we're just adding a UUID validator, which we pull in right from Symfony. So we haven't even written that part ourselves, but it's the first time that we're actually adding some sensible validation into core. UIDs are a really important one to have validated, because if you don't have that, then sites break all the time, because if there's one letter gone or one letter missing, then something can be really broken. Well, actually, it still could be broken because nothing was validated. There was just a constraint on it, but there's no validation on import yet. That's happening way later. So we're skipping ahead to Drupal 9.1. And from this point on, we can actually deprecate some config schemas. So this is also not strictly related to config schema validation, but it's an important part to ensure the cleanliness of our config system. And this is where Drupal 10.1, so we're skipping ahead a big jump of time again. We're actually adding a new constraint, our second constraint, the plugin exists constraint. This is, as the name suggests, a constraint that checks if a plugin exists in your system. So for example, if you were to manually edit a YAML file of configuration, you shouldn't, but you could, and you type in like you have a block with the name of a view in it, and you type in view dot something, and you do a config import, then your site is broken with no way of recovering except for like reverting the change and doing another config import. This piece will ensure that it will check that this plugin exists on the system. This is also in recipes something interesting, because this can also check if a recipe that you're trying to import, if it references a view that's not being added by this specific recipe, like it's been misconfigured or something, then you can stop the import of the recipe. Okay, I'm already 20 slides in, and I'm only 10 minutes far, so I think I have to slow down a little bit, because otherwise we're going to be finished really soon. So there's a new schema data type as well called lang code, which is the type of language that config is stored in. This can be any standard human language supported by localized.drupal.org, like EN for English or NL for Dutch. It can also be something custom, like lawspeak, which is a language that we support in Drupal core for some reason. But yeah, those are things that can be there. So this can be used in different places in core and contrib since 10.2. There's also the choice validation constraint. Now, if you're actually going to write your own validation constraints, choice is a really important one, because this is this represents like a drop down in your backend. It can be a couple of possible values. In this case, it's going to say undefined and all, but it could be a callback to a PHP function that checks in your database, or that does some kind of API callback or whatever. This can be something that's defined in your PHP code, which is where the promise that we could write something that checks config from outside of Drupal kind of breaks, because this needs a running PHP somewhere to evaluate the callback that we define. I was looking at my speaker notes, and I have the speaker notes for another slide here, so that was kind of confusing for a second. So required label, this is where the speaker notes were coming from, is another new schema type, which is a label. It extends from label, and label extends from string, with the additional part that the label can be translated, and a normal string is just one in one language, so it has a difference in the actual data storage. A required label is just like a label, except it's always required. This is something that we can implement in a lot of places to ensure that without having to put required true everywhere in your constraints for your own code, you can just use the required label instead. And then there's a bit of a bigger one. So it looks deceptively simple. It's just fully validatable : tilde. And this means this is not for just one property. This is for a complete config schema. So not for one property. And it tells the system, this has all the constraints that are possible to add to all the properties on this schema. And there are no optional keys that can be added to an implementation of this config schema. Now, I know I said a lot of words that might not make sense, but it means, for example, there used to be at the start of Drupal 8, there used to be a property in system.settings that has been removed a while later without being deprecated first. We had some config in our own sites in our installation profile that still had that property. And once this was in, we couldn't really do a config import anymore, because the system.settings was already being converted to being fully validatable, and it was telling us there's a property here that I don't understand, that I don't have in my schema. I don't know what to do with it. There's data here that someone put here, and I have no notion of what it's supposed to do, supposed to be. I don't know what to do. So this is Drupal telling us that something in our own site's configuration is wrong. This was a challenge to figure out like what's actually breaking, why is this breaking. But once we figured it out, just like a one-line removal in the YAML file, and it worked again. But this is a way that we can remove implicitness from the system, because before this, it depends on the code of the module if something was required or not. And we can actually introduce this into our schemas by using this specific type. In general, in the past, most keys were implicitly required, with the exception of third-party settings and the subkeys of dependencies. But from this point on, we can be more strict about those things. I have the release note here on my speaker notes, and the literal thing that's in here is, in other words, today requiredness is implicit. It depends on the module's code. It's impossible to know based on the config schema. Only with trial and error you can figure this out. And even then, a single new code path could possibly cause a key that seems optional to suddenly be required. Like if I read this, you can feel that doesn't feel like developer-y. That feels weird and something that we don't want. This is our path out of it. Now for something a little bit different, which is the config targets key in Form API. This is to ensure that you can make it a lot easier for your custom forms which work with config, or your admin forms, that they know where to save something. And this will automatically validate the constraints that are being put on the schema. It will automatically validate it with the value that you fill in your admin. This has allowed us to remove like hundreds and hundreds of lines of code from core, which is awesome. Like deleting code is the best feeling ever. It's really nice. Like for me, it's one of my personal goals. If I can delete more code than I write on a day, then I did like a good thing. Yeah. This is only for simple configuration, by the way, but this is like a really nice way of removing a lot of hook form kind of implementations. So it allows for cleaner code and one source of truth, which is in the config schema. So there's also some config entities that are validatable today, or since then too, which are block content types, node types, shortcut sets, and menus. I'm going in maybe a bit of a weird ordering here, but I'm following like every day I will check the git checkout of Drupal core, and I'll check is something related to config. Oh, I'll put it in the slides. So that's the ordering of my slides. So it's a time-based ordering. So we've made labels stricter, which a label is a thing that is related to a config entity, and it's being used to be printed somewhere. Before this change, you could have like a tab character in there, you could have a new line in there, you could have all kinds of different things in there. And if you're writing some kind of generic config entity mapper or config entity listing, then suddenly things are on multiple lines, they look weird, they have emojis where they're not supposed to. Like this has all been made a lot stricter since this patch. Another new data type. So bytes are a data type that configures like how big a file can be or how big something can be. This is like 5 MB or 6 KB or those kinds of notations that you maybe encountered on a few times. Before this, actually, in the config schema, it could be written as gigabytes, and the config schema didn't care, but your site would definitely break. And this is something that now, with the bytes type, your config has to be correct. So earlier we had the plugin exists. This is entity bundle exists. This is a validation constraint that's actually quite related to the plugin exists, but it checks that a bundle on an entity exists. It takes the name of an entity bundle as an argument, and that's the only argument it has. So for example, this property in this config schema that we define this on has to be article or page or. Yeah. Yes. So node here is the entity type. You're right. So what this config schema tells us the value that belongs in the config file that's in your config directory has to be a bundle of node. Does that make sense? Oh, jeez. Plugin exists. Oh. No, thanks. Plugin exists, has to be implemented in a lot of places, and since this commit, it's been done. Luckily, this is a slide with a lot of words. Yeah, sure.
How does that work with the fact that we don't really have a concept of plugin type yet?
I don't understand.
Well, with entity types, the entity type is a defined thing. It's in the annotation and imminently the attribute. But plugin types, over the years, there have been various kind of ad hoc ways of defining what a plugin type is. But as far as I know, unless things have changed in more recently, there wasn't a concept of a plugin type. Of how to identify a plugin type. I mean, we know what a plugin type is. We have the block plugin type. We have the action plugin type. But there isn't a way of identifying a plugin type formally.
No, so we actually just made a list of things that we wanted it to implement on, and we just implemented those. So it's maybe not on all the cases, but Adam Honig, I think his name is, just wrote a list of things where we all needed to work on, and we worked on those, and that's this. So maybe it's not completely done yet, but for all of the things in core, it should be. If, yeah, he and Wim and me, didn't forget anything.
In the previous slide, the plugin type was kind of identified by the class, the manager class, right? So you could put any plugin manager classes, and that would kind of declare the plugin. I think there's no, because unfortunately the plugin system is kind of, each manager is kind of doing it on its own. There's inheritance, but still it's kind of a separate system, each one.
Yeah, but luckily that's a question for maybe another session. So I'll try to get back on track into what I was, but sorry for not having a better answer on this. That was a good answer. So this is a meta issue on Drupal.org. Star.settings, which is actually all of those things now have validation constraints applied to them. So if you want to do it for yourself, like for simple configuration, these are all simple configurations, you can look at those. It says Drupal 11 here. Some things are actually have been done in 10.2, some things have been done in 10.3, but like the most recent ones have been in 11. There's validation constraints to core date formats. There's now validation constraints to editor, which when you think about the fact that Wim Leers, who has been working on a lot of the configuration validation stuff, is also the maintainer of editor, it's actually kind of weird that it only is showing up now, but yeah, it ended up being a bit more complicated than expected. So the config exists constraint now takes a prefix where you can prefix that a kind of thing has to be, in this case, of a filter. And as I mentioned in the beginning, having a decoupled admin UI is something that needs to be, or that's being worked on. Vocabularies are one thing that is now able to accept validation through the API and not just during form submissions. Previously, you could have like an empty string in the description field if you were to submit it, but the config schema tells us that it's not allowed to have an empty string. It's a required thing. So this is now being validated. And this is where we're actually doing something, I don't want to say useful, but maybe something useful for the first time since I've started all of these slides. Like, config that gets imported, that gets shipped with a module, is now validated against the schema that's being defined in that module. So it's taken us until Drupal 10.3 before like the config that ships with a module is correct for that module. Before that, it could have been correct. It could have not been. We had no idea really. So this works for both recipes and for the normal module install. There's a new data type. It's called weight. Well, actually, it has config validation for weight because weight was already a data type. But like, this is a really good question. Like, how do you validate a weight? It has to be an integer. That's something that we know. But like, what's the size of this? I have the answer. So the thing is, a weight can be negative or positive. And it can be like, if you drag something, it can be like maybe -50 to +50. But if you have a bigger list of things, then maybe -100 to +100. Like, where do you put the limit? Well, it has to not break your database. So minus PHP max int size to plus PHP max int size. And that's the configuration constraint that now lives there. And that's how we define it. It has to be like not so big that it breaks your database. So that's the size that it now can be minus or plus. Now, to ensure that all of these config validation is actually something that keeps on being better and that we don't regress, there's actually a test job in Drupal core that tests the state of the current validatability of the system. And this is currently disabled, I think, but because it tends to be a little bit flaky, but it's something that we check regularly to ensure that we don't regress in adding validation to stuff. All the config schema types for field types that have no settings, they can just be validatable because they have no settings and there's no extra validation to add. So we did that, and that, like, I'll show us a graph later. This was like a big bump in the graph. So the type resolver, which is a thing that checks if how your config schema looks. A config schema can have something like %parent or %key to relate to another part of the config schema. This could be whatever. It could be %parents or parents or something, and the type resolver would try to resolve it and it would fail and it would have no idea what to do. Like, we now have some validation in the type resolver to resolve that the expression that's being defined is actually an expression that can be resolved, which is a lot of resolving in the same sentence. It used to be like completely, it would just give you no useful error whatsoever. So starting from Drupal 10.3, the recipes team has ensured that we can actually install a site from existing configuration without an installation profile being there, which is something that allows like a even less than minimal sites to be used as a base for your installation if you're using existing config or if you're using a recipe. There's a lang code property that's on a lot of simple configuration, which appeared even on configuration that had no properties that were translatable. So you could have some kind of configuration with lang code NL, and it would have only English values or only like Booleans, and like no, that makes no sense. So to reduce the size of our config and to make sites faster to import, we removed it from all the simple config that contained no translatable values and added it to those that had some translatable value. There's validation constraints on user.role now, and to system.action, and to language.entity, and to search.page. and do language content testing. Like, we've done a lot of things that have actually increased the configuration validation of our entire system. Now, the next slide is maybe a bit not strictly related, but it's recipes have been added to core, which uses all of the things that we talked about to ensure that their properties are correct according to the specs that are in the system. So what's happening now? Well, not now, but lately. Wim posted something on social media a while ago that we're at 50% of all the simple config being fully validatable by Drupal core. This was at April 15th. So a couple of months ago, we're starting to make a lot of progress. There's a slide here of a graph that tells you like the progress that we've been making. I'll get to another graph a little bit later. This was the first iteration of that graph. Wim has made a script that does a git checkout starting at January 1st, 2023. Does a Drupal site install. Installs the configuration inspector module, uses a Drush script to generate statistics on all the settings of the site, all the validation properties, paths of the currently installed site, export it to some file on disk, and then go to the next day, see if there's a git commit there. If there's not, go to the next day, and then do the same thing again, and then do it again, and do that for like all the days since January 1st, 2023. And he added even more lines to it. And this is our current progress dashboard. This is where we are now. Earlier today in the recipes update, there was a mention that config validation might be close to being done. Well, actually, if you look at relative progress, which is the blue line, we are at 45% of a Drupal core install, which is, you can see that we're definitely making progress. We're definitely getting there, but close to being done might be a bit of an overexcited way of putting it. We're also working on some other things, such as untying config validation from form validation in more places, adding constraints to all the config entity types, and a JSON API post and patch support for fully validatable config entities, which allows like the experience builder use case or your own Drupal admin project that you want to build for a reason that might be there. So I'm going to do a quick recap. If you want to do it yourself, you're going to add your types and ensure that they are correct. If you look in this file in Drupal core, core.datatypes.schema.yaml, you can find all the base types that are being defined by Drupal core, and you can steal those and use those and ensure that your stuff is right. You can add constraints. If you search for constraints : in the Drupal core codebase, you will find all the examples out there. If you're adding simple configuration, then you're going to use config targets to ensure that you don't have to write any manual form validation and it will all just work. And you can use config inspector to ensure that everything is 100% validatable. It has like a -- to do flag, and this will help you to find all things that you can work on to help us get to that line to 100%. So you can find this on recipes on Drupal Slack. If you look for the combination of those two issue tags, then you can find all of the things. Are there any questions?
I think I didn't fully get this, how this works with the obsolete or that the conflict that no longer exists and it would fail, but you have something built in that it doesn't fail, I guess, or that it tolerates the value being there.
It doesn't tolerate a fault. It actually yells at you with an exception like, something's wrong, this is wrong, fix it. So it's not fault tolerant, it's yelling at developers to fix their things.
Okay, let's say I have some plugin deriver that gives me depending on some dynamic condition, defines this or that plugins.
Mm-hmm.
Something changes, the plugin no longer this specific derivative no longer exists. That is in the config. I'm trying to import my config, it doesn't work.
Yep.
Now I have to manually go into the YAML file and clean it up. Because wouldn't we want there some more nice process in the UI to be able to clean up the config?
Sure, go ahead.
But that's okay. But right now the idea is that you have to do it in the YAML. That's right now.
Shouldn't that be handled by config dependencies?
Yeah, should be, but maybe in some cases it's too
Yeah.
dynamic and they don't declare the dependency in the right.
Yeah, if you don't declare your dependencies in the right way, this could be something that happens. But if you do, then config dependencies
Yeah, so
solves
like
this. But it's something that if we have 100% validatability, it shouldn't like break anymore. But this is something that will at least tell you that if something is configured in a way that Drupal doesn't understand what to do with it, it will yell at you during config import to ensure that it knows that it has all the things that it knows what to do with, or that it only has those things that it knows how to handle.
I'm thinking of like you scan a directory of templates, and each template you register some kind of plugin, and then you delete the template, but it's not something that is declared as a dependency.
Yeah, but then you have config in your site that your site doesn't know what to do with. So I mean, you're already in a shitty situation. So I don't know how to make that better for you. Okay.
I don't see any questions in the app.
There were no questions in the app. Okay, yeah.
So I have a question about the target configuration, I think it was.
Yeah, config target. Yeah.
Config target.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this would like alter the form widget to add the constraints itself. So if you have a string like and you put a limit of 20 characters, the form widget, the form element would have also this in the
Yeah.
so you would change the form element configuration.
No, so the only thing, so if you have a config schema that defines, let me go and find it. Yeah. No, that wasn't it. Here, yeah. So the only thing that you need is your config target, and there's some code in core in the form API handling that will look at this. It will find the schema file for user.settings. It will find the verify email property in user.settings. It will find the constraints that are related to that property and all the types that are bubbling up to it or that it bubbles up to. And it will apply those on form submit, and it will give you just like a standard error message in your form that will tell you like the validation message for that.
So it would validate the value on from validation and submission, but it would not like alter the element. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
And in your form API code, that this is the only line you need to add.
Okay.
Okay. Can you?
Thank you.
So while we're on that slide, given that we have a schema that describes the structure of the config and that we have a way of saying how any particular item in that schema needs to be validated, has there been any work done towards generating admin forms automatically for config?
That sounds really cool.
I looked into it a while ago before config target was added, and what I found really hard was how to get the schema out of the config system.
So look at if you Google this title, you will find the change record, and from there you can probably get to the issue that added it. And
Okay.
there's some code in the form API part for it, I think.
Does the schema do anything about the order of keys that it will end
Yes.
up in the exported?
Yes, there is order by, I think. Yes. Thank you.
Because I remember that in views, if you export, you kind of like
Yeah, sometimes things can change. So there's an order by property in config schema, and this allows you to define a callback by which the properties in the config schema in a mapping should be ordered. No, I'm not right.
key or value.
Key or value. Okay.
Okay. I mean, key. I guess key would be preferable.
It
Or
depends.
just follow the key.
Okay, so it's not a callback yet, but I think there's an issue for that.
Yeah.
Okay, So there's an issue to make it a callback. But if you're super interested in that, then Birgir can help you.
Any more questions?
Okay. If there are no more questions, then I'll let you have some time to walk to the next session. Thank you very much.